There is a moment in every refugee's life when they realize the country they fled has never truly left them. It lives in the weight of a bell. It lives in the way a man pauses before a wall of photographs, running his fingers along the edge of a frame as though touching something too precious to hold for long. And for one man standing in a basement in Virginia, surrounded by the medals and memories of 25 years of service to a country that was not his birthplace, that moment comes quietly, without ceremony, in the middle of an ordinary afternoon. If you have ever left something behind, a home, a family, a version of yourself you never got to finish becoming, then this story belongs to you. It is the story of what happens when the boy who ran from everything grows into the man who runs toward something, and it asks a question that no flag, no medal, no title can fully answer. When you give everything to a country that gave you a second chance, what do you owe the one that gave you your first? By the end of this story, you will understand why a man who managed $1 billion navy, who dove into the cold Atlantic darkness to bring home the son of a slain president, who stood before the United States Senate and promised to build the most powerful fighting force the world had ever seen, stood in a Hanoi meeting room and could not stop smiling. And why that smile carried 50 years of grief and gratitude and something that has no name in any language. His name is Hung Cao, and this is where his story begins, not in the halls of the Pentagon, not even in the cold waters of the Atlantic, where history once waited for him 37 meters below the surface. It begins in Saigon, in a city that no longer exists by that name, on the morning of April 30th, 1975, when a family packed what they could carry and walked away from everything they had ever known. He was 3 years old. You do not remember being 3 years old. You cannot recall the texture of the heat that morning, the sound of the city changing its voice around you, the way adults look when they are trying to appear calm for children and failing. But the body remembers what the mind cannot, and there are men who will tell you, if you ask them quietly enough, that every decision they have ever made as adults was shaped by something that happened before they had words for it. Hung Cao has never said this directly, but watch him closely in any room he enters and you will see it. The alertness, the precision, the way he moves as though the ground beneath his feet is always subject to revision. His father was an administrator for the South Vietnamese Ministry of Agriculture. His mother was from Hanoi, the ancient imperial city, where people carry their words like fine silk carefully, beautifully, with the awareness that beauty can be damaged by rough handling. They were not wealthy, they were not famous. They were a family trying to live an ordinary life in a country that had decided to stop permitting ordinary lives. And when the end came, as it had been coming for years, they left. The years that followed are the years that most refugee stories skip over, because they are years of becoming rather than arriving. The family moved through Africa, following the father's work, a Vietnamese family in the middle of the continent, speaking their language to each other at night, holding it like a lantern against the darkness. And then in 1982, they returned to now the United States, to Annandale, Virginia, to a country that was still learning what to make of the people it had helped to scatter across the earth. Hung Cao was 11 years old. He was an outsider in the total way that only children can experience the accent, the face, the lunch, the silence in the cafeteria that lands differently when you are the only one who looks like you. But he had inherited something from his parents that no relocation could touch. His mother had told him, with the certainty of someone who had lost everything except the truth, people can take your money, they can take your home, they can take your status, they cannot take your knowledge. And so he learned. He learned with the intensity of someone who understood at a cellular level that education was not a path to comfort. It was the only fortress left standing. By the time he reached Thomas Jefferson High School for Science and Technology, one of the most competitive academic institutions in the country, he had transformed that early hunger into something that looked like effortless excellence. It was not effortless. Nothing about Hung Cao has ever been effortless. But he had learned to make effort look like nature, which is perhaps the deepest form of discipline there is. And then he made a decision that his classmates heading toward law firms and medical schools and investment banks may not have fully understood at the time. He applied to the United States Naval Academy at Annapolis, Maryland, not because it was the most prestigious path available to him, but because of what it represented. A country had taken his family in, had given them, against all reasonable expectation, a future. And Hung Cao, at 17 years old, decided that the correct response to that gift was not to profit from it. It was to defend it. There is something about Annapolis that does something to a person. The Severn River in the early morning, the white dress uniforms on the parade ground, the weight of American naval history pressing down from every wall, every portrait, every tradition that has survived 2.5 centuries of war and peace and everything in between. For most of the young men and women who enter through those gates, it is an encounter with greatness from the outside, a striving towards something enormous. For Hung Cao, it was also an encounter with himself. a Vietnamese refugee standing in the middle of the oldest military institution in the country, claiming his place in a story that had not initially included him. He graduated in 1996 with a degree in ocean engineering. He would later earn a master's degree in applied physics from the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, California, and a fellowship at Harvard. But in 1996, he was 25 years old and about to enter a world that would test him in ways that no classroom could prepare for. He became a Navy diver, an explosive ordnance disposal specialist, a man trained to go into places that had been specifically designed to kill him and come back out. This is worth sitting with for a moment. There is a particular kind of courage that is not about the absence of fear. It is about the presence of purpose. Hung Cao dove into waters where bombs waited in the dark. He entered buildings in Iraq and Afghanistan where the wrong step was a final step. He trained other men to do the same, and through all of it, he maintained the quality that his commanders would consistently note in fitness reports, that quality that is harder to teach than any technical skill. He stayed calm, he thought clearly. He found solutions in the moments when solutions felt impossible. In the summer of 1999, he was 28 years old. He held the rank of ensign. He was assigned to the USNS Grasp AR-52, a salvage and rescue vessel of the United States Navy, when a call came that would mark him for the rest of his life. On the evening of July 16, 1999, John F. Kennedy Jr., son of the 35th President of the United States, took off from a New Jersey airport in a small Piper Saratoga plane. He had his wife Carolyn beside him and her sister Lauren was in the back. They were heading to Martha's Vineyard for a family wedding. The weather had seemed manageable. The route was one he had flown before, and then, 62 minutes after takeoff, the plane descended rapidly from the radar screen and disappeared into the black water of the Atlantic Ocean. For 5 days, the country held its breath. John Kennedy Jr. was not simply a man. He was an image that had been embedded in the American psyche since 1963, when a 3-year-old boy in a blue coat stood at his father's coffin and raised his small hand in a salute that an entire nation would carry for the rest of its life. He had grown up in public, had become something the country needed him to be: beautiful, accomplished, the continuation of something that had been violently interrupted. And now he was somewhere at the bottom of the ocean, and the country needed him found. The Grasp moved to the search area. The water was cold, around 11 degrees Celsius, and the plane had gone down to a depth of approximately 37 meters. That is not an impossibly deep dive, but it is deep enough to be serious, cold enough to be dangerous, dark enough to be disorienting, and the emotional weight of the mission pressed down on every man aboard with a force that had nothing to do with water pressure. Hung Cao led the dive team. He was the one who went down into that darkness. He designed a method for locating the aircraft using sonar that found the wreckage within 12 hours of beginning the search. He established the cable rigging system at depth that would allow the plane to be raised. He drafted more than 25 urgent dispatches and a 15-page action report. And he was one of the men who recovered the bodies of John F. Kennedy Jr., Carolyn Bessette Kennedy, and Lauren Bessette from the floor of the Atlantic Ocean. Years later, Hung Cao would speak about this mission with a quietness that is distinct from silence. He would say, "We did not do this for politics. We did this to bring a family's suffering to a close." He would say, "It was an honor to bring an American son home from the ocean so that he could rest." There is no performance in those words. They are the words of a man who understood, at 37 meters below the surface, surrounded by darkness and cold and the debris of a life cut short, that some things matter beyond rank, beyond career, beyond any personal calculation. He carried those 3 people back to the world, and the world did not fully understand what that cost him. The Secretary of the Navy awarded him the Navy Achievement Medal with Gold Star. Senator Edward Kennedy, the last surviving brother of a family that had suffered more than its share of loss, wrote him a personal letter of thanks. That letter is framed. It hangs in the basement of a house in Purcellville, Virginia, surrounded by challenge coins and deployment photographs and a ship's bell that rings with a sound like history clearing its throat. The basement that Hung Cao calls Cao headquarters is a room that rewards close attention. It is not a trophy room, although there are trophies. It is not a museum, although there is history on every wall. It is something more personal than either of those things. It is the inside of a man's memory made physical, the dark wood shelves that reach to the ceiling. The photographs arranged with the precision of someone who believes that the past deserves to be looked at directly. The American flag in the place of highest honor, not because it is required, but because it is meant. Between those shelves, there are hundreds of challenge coins, the metal tokens that pass between military units and allies and commanders as a currency of shared experience. Each one is a story, each one is a person, each one is a day that Hung Cao will carry until he no longer can. His wife April, who knows the meaning of each coin in ways that wives of sailors know things their husbands cannot articulate, has watched those coins accumulate across 25 years. She knows what they cost, not in the way that money costs something, but in the way that time costs something, and sleep costs something, and the long silences after a deployment end and a husband returns looking slightly different from the man who left. April Lackey is from Buena Vista, Virginia. She is a writer. She is a woman who had a career trajectory of her own, published essays in the Washington Post and the Washington Times, a literary voice of real quality, and who made a deliberate choice to redirect that trajectory in service of a life that most people would not have chosen. She and Hung Cao met in 1997. He was teaching a martial arts class. She was a student. He holds a 9th-degree black belt in a Korean martial art. She apparently found this compelling. They married in 1999 and almost immediately began a life that would involve 13 separate moves across the United States and the world. 5 children, including a set of twins and an adopted child from Thailand. Years of homeschooling because the constant relocations made traditional schooling impractical. And the sustained, grinding anxiety of being the person who stays behind when the person you love goes somewhere that might kill them. Every military spouse understands what April understood every time a phone rang unexpectedly. The brief stop of breath. The calibration of voice before saying hello. The discipline required to not transmit fear to children who are watching you for signals about how to interpret the world. She has written about this. She has spoken about it. And she does so without self-pity, which is its own form of courage. Quieter than her husband's, less decorated but no less real. Their home in Purcellville was built in 2016, the year Hung Cao transitioned from commanding the Navy's Explosive Ordnance Disposal and Dive Training Command in Panama City, Florida, to a posting at the Pentagon. It sits on a lot of approximately 5,000 square meters, surrounded by trees, in a subdivision called Braddock Oaks in a small town that Hung Cao has called his forever home. The phrase is not casual. For a man who has moved 13 times, who has lived in government housing and temporary quarters, and all the impermanent arrangements that military life requires. The word forever carries a weight that most people never have occasion to assign to a piece of real estate. The town is Purcellville, in Loudoun County, Virginia. About an hour's drive west of Washington. A population of roughly 9,000 people, church steeples and tree-lined streets, and the particular quality of quiet that you find in places where people have chosen to make a life rather than having one assigned to them. It is a place that values family, faith, and the kind of stability that Hung Cao spent 2.5 decades building toward without ever quite being able to stand still long enough to inhabit it. In September of 2024, their first grandchild was born. Hung Cao announced this with the pride of a man who has negotiated peace treaties and led combat operations and recovered the dead from the ocean floor, and who has discovered that none of those things prepared him for the feeling of holding a new life connected by blood to his own. The house in Purcellville, which had been a destination, became something else in that moment. It became an origin, but there is another story running beneath the surface of the house and the metals and the ship's bell and the framed letter from the Kennedy family. There is a story about what it means to serve a country that you came to as a refugee, to spend your life defending an idea that you were not born into but chose, completely and deliberately, the way adults choose the most important things. And that story cannot be told properly from the basement in Virginia. It has to be told from somewhere else, from the other side of a 50-year absence, from a conference room in Hanoi, where a man who once had to leave everything now represented the most powerful navy in the world. The question that Hung Cao does not answer directly, that he perhaps cannot answer directly, is this one. When you have given 50 years to becoming American, when you have earned every right and title and honor that the country offers, and then you walk back into the place you came from, what are you, in that moment? What are you exactly when you are both the boy who ran and the man who came back? On the 2nd day of November 2025, a military transport carrying United States Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth and his delegation landed in Hanoi. Among the officials in that delegation was the newly confirmed Undersecretary of the Navy, Hung Cao. He had been sworn into the position on October 1, 2025, after the Senate confirmed his nomination, the first person of Vietnamese descent ever to hold that office. He was 54 years old. He had been gone from Vietnam for 50 years. There is a particular mathematics to exile that only those who have lived it fully understand. 50 years is not simply a long time. It is a life. It is the complete arc from childhood to the threshold of old age, the entire span across which a person becomes whoever they are going to be. For Hung Cao, those 50 years had been filled with such density of experience, the refugee years, the academy, the dives, the deployments, the campaigns, the losses, the honors that Vietnam had existed for most of that time as something more like a feeling than a place. As something in certain kinds of cooking, a cadence in his mother's voice when she spoke of Hugh. The particular quality of absence that you carry when the place you came from has been replaced in your mind by a photograph rather than a living memory, and then the plane landed, and the photograph became and the street had sounds, and the sounds had heat inside them. And Hung Cao, Undersecretary of the Navy of the United States of America, stood on Vietnamese soil for the first time in half a century and did something that no protocol document covers. He felt it. He spoke about this afterward in an interview conducted in Vietnamese, with the directness of a man who has learned that honesty requires less energy than performance. He said he had never imagined, 50 years after leaving as a refugee, that he would return as a representative of the President of the United States, sitting across the table from Vietnamese government officials to discuss defense cooperation and the future of the bilateral relationship. He said it in the simple way that people say things that are too large to dramatize. He just said it, and the simplicity of it was more affecting than any prepared statement could have been. The meetings were substantive. General Phan Van Dong, Vietnam's Minister of National Defense, welcomed the American delegation and noted the significance of the timing. The visit coincided with the 30th anniversary of normalized diplomatic relations between the two countries, established in 1995, 2 decades after the war ended and the families ran. The discussions covered naval cooperation, the handover of patrol vessels and training aircraft, the ongoing work of accounting for the remains of soldiers from both sides who never came home from that war. The United States announced an additional $130 million in funding for dioxin remediation at the Bien Hoa Air Base, bringing the total American commitment for environmental cleanup in Vietnam to $430 million. These were not symbolic gestures. They were the practical architecture of a relationship being rebuilt, board by board, after decades of damage. But there was a dimension to Hung Cao's presence in that room that no diplomatic communique could fully capture. A German journalist named Bach Pham, a veteran correspondent who had covered 6 American secretaries of defense visiting Vietnam over 20 years, was there. He wrote afterward about meeting Hung Cao, about the warmth of the man, the openness, the quality of laughter in the room. He described the exchange as unusually human for a high-level defense meeting. He noted that Hung Cao had recently, in January of 2026, signed and publicly released a formal letter of apology to the sailors and Marines who had been discharged from service for refusing the mandatory COVID-19 vaccine under the Biden administration. In that letter, Hung Cao had said plainly, "We failed you." He called those dismissed service members warriors of conscience. He promised it would not happen again on his watch. More than 2,000 Navy and Marine Corps members had been separated from service, many receiving less than honorable discharges that cost them veterans' benefits. Hung Cao moved to correct the records, not because it was politically required, because it was right. This is the quality that keeps appearing in the accounts of people who have dealt with Hung Cao across the full range of his career. Not just competence, not just courage, though both are well documented. It is the capacity to hold power without forgetting what power is for, to sit at the table with presidents and generals and defense ministers, and still be capable of writing a letter to a sailor who lost his career and saying, "I see you. What happened to you was wrong. I am sorry." April was with him in spirit through all of it, as she had been for 26 years. He had said so publicly before the Senate Armed Services Committee on the day of his confirmation hearing, in language that was neither rehearsed nor decorated. He had said, "April has moved our family 13 times. She gave birth to our first child while I was deployed to Iraq. When I was gone, she was both mother and father, repairman, nurse, teacher, and coach. Every military spouse knows what it is to pray when the phone rings." He had turned to where she was sitting in that Senate chamber and said thank you, in front of the committee and the cameras in the record. Not as a performance, as a fact. The house in Purcellville carries April's hands in every room. The farmhouse modern design, the warm cream walls and dark wood tones, the open layout that speaks of a woman who spent years making do with small spaces and finally built the kind of home where people can breathe. She had homeschooled all 5 children through the years of constant movement, choosing stability of education over the convenience of the nearest public school. She had written a co-authored book called Free to Deploy that won an award for its documentation of the specific grief of military family life. She had volunteered as an emergency medical technician and studied social work at Everett University to help people living with trauma, having learned firsthand what it looks like when it goes unaddressed. She is co-author of the memoir Call Me American, published in June of 2024, which Hung Cao and April wrote together. The title is said in various forms across many years. It is not an apology. It is not an erasure. It is a declaration. I am the thing I chose to become. I am the country I decided to serve. Call me American. But Vietnam called him something else, or perhaps it called him back to something he had never entirely let go. After the official meetings concluded, there was a moment captured in a photograph that circulated quietly through Vietnamese diaspora communities, where Hung Cao stood beside Ba Pham, the journalist, and smiled with the particular fullness that comes when something long compressed is briefly released. He had been in Hanoi only 2 days. He had not had time to go south to Ho Chi Minh City, the place that used to be Saigon, he said directly when asked. He said, "That is down south. I could not get there. I only had 2 days." He said it without grievance, which was itself a kind of grief. The side trip he could not take, the city he could not revisit, the street where the family once lived, which may or may not still exist under that name, in a city that has been renamed and rebuilt and overlaid with 50 years of a different history. He carried all of that in the smile. And still he smiled. In the months following the Hanoi visit, the world continued to move in directions that placed Hung Cao at the intersection of history in ways that would have been unimaginable to the 3-year-old leaving Saigon in 1975. At a ceremony naming the naval vessel USNS Lassing in May of 2026, he addressed an audience and offered a statement that spread quickly across military and diplomatic circles. He said, with the measured gravity of a man who chooses his words the way divers choose their equipment carefully, knowing that the wrong choice has consequences, that America is the best friend in the world, always present, always willing to help. But America can also be your most terrifying enemy. If provoked, he said, America will own your skies and come for you at midnight. While you and your wife are sleeping soundly, the room erupted. People who were there describe it as the laughter of recognition, the way crowds respond when someone says plainly what everyone already understood but needed to hear said aloud by someone with the authority to mean it. The remark was widely understood as a reference to events in early January of 2026, when Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro and his wife were apprehended in the early morning hours in Caracas in a rapid American military operation. Reports from multiple sources indicated that the USS Iwo Jima had been positioned off the Venezuelan coast and played a role in the operation's logistics. Hung Cao's exact role in what happened has never been officially confirmed. He has not spoken about it directly. What is documented is that as Undersecretary of the Navy, the coordination of naval assets for such an operation would fall within his area of responsibility. And what is observable is that he said what he said in public at a naming ceremony and smiled while he said it. And the room understood him completely. There is a word in Vietnamese for the feeling of pride layered over sorrow, layered over love. It does not translate cleanly into English, but it is the word for what you feel when you have lost something and found something and are not entirely sure whether the finding makes the losing better or simply different. Hung Cao has not used that word publicly, but the German journalist who watched him smile in that Hanoi conference room, and the Vietnamese American community members who watched the video of his Senate testimony and wept without being able to fully explain why, and the sailors who received his apology letter and felt seen for the first time in years, all of them were responding to something in him that has no adequate English translation. The answer is somewhere inside him. And as the delegation prepared to leave Hanoi, as Hung Cao stepped back toward the aircraft that would carry him away from the country of his birth once more, a reporter asked him the question that everyone wanted answered, but no one had quite managed to frame correctly. He answered in Vietnamese, and then he paused, and in the pause, something crossed his face that none of the cameras quite caught clearly enough to describe. The basement in Purcellville is quiet on most mornings before the house wakes up. Hung Cao comes down early. This is documented not by any official record but by the small evidence that accumulates around a man's habits: the coffee cup on the L-shaped desk made from a single slab of natural wood, the chair turned slightly toward the wall of photographs rather than toward the monitors, the quality of stillness in a room that during the day hums with purpose and decision. In those early hours before the weight of a navy of 1 million people and a budget of $250 billion per year presses back in, he sits with the things he has kept. The photographs of his parents when they were young, a version of his father and mother that existed before 1975, before the word refugee applied to them, before the life they had built was dismantled in a single morning and carried away in whatever could fit in their hands. He looks at those photographs the way people look at things they are trying to memorize, as though looking carefully enough might yield something that the image itself cannot provide, an explanation perhaps, or simply a continuance. The sense that the thread running from those two young faces in the photograph runs directly through him and out the other side, into the 5 children sleeping upstairs, into the grandchild born in September of 2024, into something that has not happened yet. The ship's bell hangs where anyone entering the basement will see it immediately. It is solid bronze, polished to the kind of shine that requires maintenance, which means it is polished regularly, which means someone in this house considers the maintaining of it an act worth performing. In the Navy, a ship's bell marks time. It announces the changes of watch, the hours of meals, the moments when the ship moves from one condition to another. It is a technology so old that its origins predate the country that Hung Cao has spent his life serving. And here it is, in a house in a small Virginia town, still doing what ship's bells do. Marking the hours, insisting that time is passing and that what we do with it is the only question that finally matters. On the wall of the gym in his basement, someone painted words that translate roughly as, "Cowards never start a ball, and the weak die along the way." It is the kind of statement that sounds harsh in comfortable circumstances and clarifying in difficult ones. Hung Cao has lived in circumstances where the statement was not metaphorical. He has been in waters where turning back was genuinely not an option. He has been in buildings in Iraq and Afghanistan where the words coward and courage were not abstractions. He has sent the letter of apology to sailors who lost their careers and their benefits and their sense of belonging to the institution they had pledged their lives to. And he has said plainly that they were failed because the ability to say I was wrong, we were wrong, is its own form of the courage that those words on the wall describe. His mother's voice is in that room too, though she is not present. The voice that told him what people cannot take from you. She said it in the way that mothers who have lost everything say things not as philosophy but as survival instruction. Knowledge. They cannot take your knowledge. And so he learned, and so he kept learning. The master's degree, the Harvard fellowship, the 25 years of operational experience that no classroom could have provided and no diploma can fully represent. The room in the basement is the room of a man who took his mother's words completely literally and never stopped. There is a photograph in that room of a young man and a young woman taken in 1997. He is teaching, she is learning. They do not yet know what they are to each other, or perhaps they know already and are simply waiting for the knowledge to become official. April looks, in that photograph, like a woman who has decided something without quite announcing it. Hung Cao looks like a man who has not yet realized that the most consequential mission of his life has already begun. They have been married for more than 26 years. She has moved 13 times. She has raised 5 children largely alone during the long seasons of deployment. She has written books about what it costs and kept writing anyway. She has studied trauma response so that she could help the people in whose company she found herself through no plan of her own, the wives and children and veterans navigating the long aftermath of service. In September of 2024, they became grandparents, the first grandchild. Hung Cao did not give a speech about it, so far as anyone has recorded. He simply mentioned it, in the way that men who have seen the full range of what the world can do sometimes mention things quietly, with a weight that the lightness of the words cannot fully conceal. A new person. Connected to all of this, to the bell and the coins and the photographs and the letter from Senator Kennedy and the walls painted with hard truths and the flag that hangs above all of it. A new person who did not have to run from anything to get here. When the reporter in Hanoi asked Hung Cao what it felt like to return to Vietnam after 50 years, he answered in Vietnamese. He said he had never imagined it. He said it simply, without ornamentation, in the language he had spoken first, before English became the language of his public life. His career, his ambition, his love story, his apology, his Senate testimony. He said it in Vietnamese, and it landed differently in Vietnamese. It landed in the part of the language that carries things English cannot, the specific weight of a word spoken by a person who left as a child and came back as someone almost unrecognizable to that child. And yet, Professor Nguyen Tuan, speaking about the visit, said something that is worth holding. He said, Hung Cao's return is a symbol of reconciliation, not because of what he did in those 2 days in Hanoi, but because of what his presence meant, because the Vietnamese government approved his entry, knowing exactly who he was, knowing his views, knowing the community he represented and the grief that community had carried across 50 years. And still they said yes. And the American government sent him, knowing the same things, knowing he was not just an official but a person whose return carried a meaning that no official could fully control. Both sides said yes. Professor Nguyen Tuan called it a handshake, the kind that takes decades to arrive at. Hung Cao did not get to go to Ho Chi Minh City. The schedule was too tight. 2 days is not enough to close 50 years. Perhaps no number of days is enough to close 50s. Perhaps that is not the goal. Perhaps the goal is simpler and harder than closure. Perhaps the goal is just to keep the thread intact. The one that runs from the photographs of his parents to the grandchild born in September. The one that runs from Saigon in 1975 to Purcellville, Virginia in 2026. The one that runs from the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, 37 meters down in the cold dark, all the way up to a room where a ship's bell hangs on a wall and a man gets up early every morning to sit with what he has kept. In the gym, under the painted words about cowards and the weak, there is a framed display about the recovery of John F. Kennedy Jr. It shows the technical diagram of the USS Grasp. It shows photographs of Hung in the water, in the vessel, in the aftermath. A 3-year-old boy running from Saigon grew into a 28-year-old man who dove into the Atlantic and brought home the son of a president. He did it, he said, because every American son deserves to come home from the ocean. Because bringing someone home, returning them to the people who love them, is the most basic thing one human being can do for another. The ship's bell in the basement of the house in Purcellville does not ring on its own. Someone has to ring it. Hung Cao rings it on certain occasions. His children know the occasions, as children know the private rituals of their parents' lives without always being told explicitly what they mean. The grandchild will learn the occasions in time, will grow up in the house where the photographs are, where the flag is, where the coins are stacked in their hundreds on the shelves that reach to the ceiling. Will grow up hearing the bell and not yet understanding what it marks. Will ask, eventually, what the bell is for, and someone will say, "Your grandfather brought it home from the sea." And that will not be a complete answer, but it will be a true one. In the spring of 2026, Hung Cao became acting secretary of the Navy when his predecessor departed, the first Vietnamese American ever to hold the title. The refugee who could not go back to see the street in Saigon where he was born is now responsible for the largest naval force in the history of the world. 1 million people, $250 billion per year. The power, as he said at a naming ceremony, while a room full of Navy personnel laughed and understood, to own your skies and come for you at midnight. He manages it all from various rooms, including the one in the basement that he calls headquarters. The room with the challenge coins and the Kennedy photographs, and the apology letters that he signed because he believed in signing them. The room with the desk made from a single piece of natural wood and the photographs of his parents when they were young, and the small coffee cup that is there every morning before the house wakes up. April is upstairs. The grandchild visited recently. The bell hangs where anyone walking in will see it first. Outside, the Blue Ridge Mountains rise to the west of Purcellville, Virginia. The light there in the early morning is the color of something beginning. A 3-year-old boy who had to run is now a man who builds, who brings people home, who rings the bell when it matters. He left everything once. He built everything twice. Is there someone in your life who gave up something for you that you never fully acknowledged and whose sacrifice you are only now beginning to understand?